Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle. Sheldon, I go away for a few days, and all of a sudden I find that all heck has broken loose with an article you wrote about Chris Kyle, the American sniper, and it got posted on Reason, as all your articles do. And I don't know if it's a record for comments at Reason, but it's got to be pretty close to one. And you stirred up a lot of adverse reaction. And I kind of felt like this was deja vu all over again from the 2003 when we were opposing the invasion of Iraq. We were among those saying, look, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. This is a clear-cut war of aggression. The sanctions, the brutal sanctions that have been enforced against Iraq had gone on for 11 years. 2 high UN officials had resigned in protest to the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children that had been killed. You had Madeleine Albright 5 years before, 96 or 7 years before, saying that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. So it was clear that U.S. officials were interested in regime change, and they just used the 9/11 fear to accomplish what the sanctions had not accomplished. And so we were there opposing this as a clear-cut war of aggression. The troops had no right to kill even one single Iraqi, much less torture them and detain them in Abu Ghraib and so forth. And I remember the hate mail flooding in about how we need to support the troops and how we need to rally behind the government and that it's our team versus their team. And it seems to me that this is just a repeat of that people just cannot, status especially, cannot confront the fact that their government was the aggressor nation in this conflict, that Iraq was the defending nation, that the United States attacked a country that had never attacked the United States, had never threatened to attack the United States, and, of course, use the troops as the instrument by which to effect that. I think that's the reason why very few people have ever called for an official investigation into George W. Bush and Dick Cheney in order to ferret out that this was a sham. It was a charade, that they were pulling on the American people with the WMDs and all that nonsense in order to make the troops feel better about wrongfully killing people and to make the American people feel better about supporting the troops who were wrongfully killing people. What do you think?
Well, yeah, that's right. I think a very important thing here is the impression that the Bush administration, and that's even a weak way to put it, the impression that the Bush administration tried to leave with the American people in those days, that Iraq was involved in 9/11. They tortured people, hoping to get them to say that. No one could ever come up with evidence. There was a rumor, there was a report that Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers who flew into, I guess, one of the World Trade Center buildings, had met in, was it Prague or someplace, with a member of the Saddam Hussein regime. That's not true. It was just something cooked up. But the impression was left, and people still believe it today. I'm not sure exactly what the polls show right now, but over the years it's shown that a significant number of people believe that. So that's one reason why people have such vitriol reaction against anyone who questions the war or calls it a war of aggression by the United States against Iraq. The movie, as I understand it, I've never made any attempt to review the movie. I haven't seen the movie, and I've never written a word about the movie. I've written about Chris Kyle. That's different. The movie, as I understand it, leaves the impression that the United States was fighting in Iraq because of 9/11. I know it shows Kyle and I think his brother watching the news the day that the buildings were hit, probably the live broadcast of the buildings were hit, and the next thing you know, he's in Iraq fighting to avenge America. So I don't know what Eastwood had in mind. Clint Eastwood had in mind as the director, but it certainly feeds this idea that Iraq was behind 9/11. 9/11 was a monstrous crime, which it was. Therefore, anything the U.S. did in Iraq was perfectly justified. And add to that the fact that America is an exceptional nation, and then it has like the 00. It's a 00, right? It's like James Bond. It's the 00 nation. We can kill with impunity. And if you question that, you will reap the whirlwind, as I can testify over the weekend. I'm not a victim. I don't mean to make myself a victim, but I spent the weekend reading Twitter, and it wasn't for the faint of heart to read what people had to say about me, because I questioned the alleged heroism of Chris Kyle.
Well, I think that's it. That you hit the nail on the head. They were trying to tie it to 9/11 in order to create the appearance that this was a defensive war, that the United States was defending itself against an attack that came into our country. Now, obviously, 9/11 itself is you'll recall Ron Paul reaped the whirlwind, too, in that famous presidential debate when he said they came over here because we, meaning the U.S. government, the troops, were over there killing them. And boy, the same sort of thing happened, man. The mainstream press went ballistic. The other candidates went ballistic. And of course, that was when Ron Paul's campaign took off, because a lot of young people and a lot of Americans realized this man's telling the truth. Well, what Bush and Cheney were trying to do was to create the appearance that this was a defensive war. And I started to say 9/11 itself was in retaliation for what the U.S. government had been doing over there. But so here they were saying, oh, we're just innocent. We haven't been doing anything. The terrorists came to attack us. And, oh, by the way, Iraq is part of this, because they're trying to create that mindset within the troops, because a lot of the troops were having serious misgivings about this. And they were trying to garner support among the American people, saying we're just defending ourselves by attacking Iraq. Well, there was never any connection. That's been firmly established. It was just a ruse, a sham. And that's what the WMD scare was about, too. That, oh, Saddam Hussein's coming over here. He's about to unleash mushroom clouds, meaning, nuclear bombs. So we have a right to go preemptively strike him and kill the Iraqis. Well, that wasn't true either. So you had a clear-cut war of aggression. And I remember, Sheldon, there were troops, especially Catholic troops, that were having serious misgivings about invading a country and killing people that had never attacked the United States and whose government had never attacked the United States. And under Catholic doctrine, those soldiers were worried about the fact that if they go kill somebody wrongfully, they've got a grave sin on their soul. And if they were to die, there's serious eternal repercussions there under Catholic doctrine. And in fact, a Catholic priest issued a letter, an announcement to his congregation saying, this is murder, that any Catholic soldier that participates in this war will be guilty of murder. He says no different from abortion, which I think everyone knows what the Catholic position is on abortion. And he was flat out saying no troop can do this. Now, why did he do that? Because this was a clear-cut war of aggression. And that's what these soldiers were worried about. Now, these people that are over here criticizing you or criticizing us for saying that these troops were not heroes, they're not doing these soldiers any favors. They think they're the ones doing these soldiers a great service by saying, you're a hero, you're a patriot, you were protecting our country. They're not doing them any service. They're, in fact, doing them a disservice. Because in order to heal, and we all know that many of these people, if not most of them, came back all screwed up in the head. The guy who kills Chris Kyle was all screwed up in the head. And in order to get your head back right after wrongfully killing people, you can't exist in denial. And if you convince yourself that you're a patriot, you're a hero, you're in denial. You've got to confront that you've wrongfully killed people. You've got to express remorse. You've got to confess. You've got to repent for what you've done. So these people that are over here criticizing us, they're doing the disservice to the troops. It's those of us that are telling the troops, the reason you're all screwed up in the head is because you have wrongfully killed people. That's what guilt does. It's those of us that are causing the troops to face the truth. We're the ones doing the service for the troops.
Well, they're never going to believe that. Number one, they believe that the U.S. service, I don't want to call them service people, the U.S. military that went over there and shot people and destroyed Iraq, which they had done the previous decade, even before the invasion. My article is actually understated because I didn't go into all that was done during the 90s to attack and destroy Iraqi society. I didn't even touch on that in the piece. But the people that believe the U.S. troops were protecting America as they see it and doing good deeds otherwise believe that. and they think it's the best service that they can do for troops coming back is to tell them that and to go after anybody that doubts that, because that's the faith they hold. And because of cognitive dissonance, they can't admit anything that clashes with that. They can't recognize any evidence or any argument, and they have this defense shield up, like Star Trek. There's a defense shield up that they're totally impervious to argument. And one way you can see that is they don't make any counter argument back. I mean, I've read dozens and dozens of comments about my article, some directed right at me, others just put up on social networks, that don't make a single argument. And I would even say back to them, in cases I wrote back and said, is that your counter argument, or can I expect a follow up? Because I don't see an argument here. Calling me a name is not an argument. Simply calling Kyle a hero is not an argument. These people, I don't think, understand what an argument is. They weren't persuaded into supporting the war in Iraq. That was just an article of faith that anything up America or the American government does has to be right. Because why? Because it's America. So they have that article of faith, and they never bothered or cared to listen to anything that dissents from that. And, frankly, I don't see a big difference between someone who goes completely bananas about expressions of disrespect for Kyle and someone who goes completely bananas over expressions of disrespect for Muhammad. I mean, I don't see the difference between those two things. And some people have even, issued veiled threats against people that criticize Kyle. So in that case, they're not different from, the people, Islamists who issue threats against people who show disrespect for Muhammad. I mean, there's a very similar mentality there. Sorry, but it's true.
Well, there's that sense that I've argued for so long that people look at the national security state apparatus that was brought into existence after World War II. I mean, you and I have talked about this. I see it as a completely alien apparatus, and President Eisenhower acknowledged that in his farewell address when he talked about the military-industrial complex as alien to America's way of life. And it certainly was no part of the American governmental system for the first 150 years of American history. But people have come to idolize the national security state. I mean, they look at it as a god even. The Christian people that look on the national security state as a god. They go to church on Sundays, but boy, the rest of the week, the national security state, the military, the CIA, the NSA, it's their god. And heaven help anybody that criticizes their god. And that's really what's going on here. And they would like nothing more than to silence those of us that are saying this was a war of aggression. The U.S. government attacked a country that never attacked the United States. A war of aggression was a type of war that was condemned as a war crime at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. So that's what the U.S. government did, and that's what they're trying to silence here. Now, the interesting question is what about the responsibility of the soldier here? And I remember when Iraq was being invaded, I telephoned a Catholic priest friend of mine who's a libertarian. And I said, Father Joe, okay, these soldiers have been put in a position of kill or be killed. The way the U.S. military has it structured, you don't have conscientious objection options when you're conscientiously objecting to a particular war. So a soldier can't say, well, I object to the Iraq war, I'm not going. I mean, they will prosecute him. They will do very bad things to him if he does that. And they did to Lieutenant Aaron Watada when he was asked to redeploy a year or two later to Iraq. But so the soldier goes over there, and I asked Father Joe, I said, what is the duty of a soldier from the perspective of Catholicism here? Can he shoot at people? Can he kill people who are shooting at him, who are defending their country from this invasion? And he said, absolutely not. That you cannot kill wrongfully, that God does not give a commandment that has an exception. Thou shalt not kill except when you're a soldier and you've been put in this position. I said, well, what does that mean then? He says, that means that if the government puts that soldier in that position, then he's just going to have to be killed. That he cannot go in there and start killing people. And the way this, even that shocked me. It's like, my gosh, but when you look at the logic of the situation, what he's saying is absolutely right. Now, keep in mind, these soldiers have signed these contracts to join the military, knowing exactly what's going to be expected of them. When the president says, you go attack that country, you go attack it. And so they're in that position of kill or be killed. And they have to suffer the consequences, the religious consequences, but also the psychological consequences. How can a person not be affected psychologically, unless he's a pathological serial killer who one thinks doesn't even have a conscience? But most of these soldiers are regular people. They have consciences. They really think that they're trying to do the right thing, and they're put in a position of wrongfully killing people. How can that not screw a person up in the head? I mean, I don't think it's possible. And I think that's why they come back all screwed up in the head, not because of PTSD. I mean, that may be one factor in it, but the fact that when you take the life of a human being who had a right to live, I don't see how that can fail to have an effect on you. So those of us that are calling it for what it is, a war of aggression, and calling on the soldiers who participate in this to confront that, to realize what they've done and what they've participated in. Because after all, Sheldon, if we don't stop it, it's just going to continue going on. They're going to keep doing this. I mean, these soldiers are effectively pawns, but they are pawns that have voluntarily put themselves in this position. And that's why I've said from the very beginning, the only solution to this thing is what our founding fathers said. Dismantle the standing army, dismantle the national security state. Because otherwise you get into this thing where average people, they don't think about it. You just have this jingoism, my team, my troops, I'm going to support them regardless. Conscience goes out the window.
Well, right. And just to invoke another authority here, one of the founders of the modern libertarian movement, Leonard Reed, wrote in a passionate essay, Conscience on the Battlefield, that an individual never escapes personal moral responsibility. Putting on a uniform and obeying the government doesn't get you out of moral responsibility. So I recommend that people look that up on the internet. You can find that conscience on the battlefield. More than one of my correspondents reminded me that Chris Kyle did not make policy, that George Bush decided to go to war in Iraq, regardless of what we think of that war. And so he was simply following orders. Now, it's funny that they say this entirely without irony, because when I hear he was only following orders, I think of Nuremberg. That was not accepted at Nuremberg. And a soldier can't simply say I was only following orders. Now, people immediately shot back and said, I'm calling Kyle a Nazi. Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. Before the Nazis, soldiers claimed they were only following orders too. They didn't invent that excuse. So it doesn't make you a Nazi. I don't think you're a nice person, but not every bad person is a Nazi. So let's get that clear. So I didn't raise the Nazis for that purpose. But as you suggest, of course he could have refused to follow orders. People say you can't refuse orders. Yes, you can. There are consequences, but you can do it. He had free will. He could have refused to go. He could have refused, number one, to sign up. After signing up, when he learned what was going to happen, he could have refused to go. And if he had gone, he could have refused to shoot people. The government, his commanding officers weren't going to put his finger on the trigger and then hold a gun to his head and said, pull the trigger. They wouldn't have done that. They weren't going to use mind control on him to make him shoot people. The worst that would have happened was he would have been court-martialed and sent to Leavenworth. That's a consequence. That's serious. I'm not making light of that. But it means he didn't have to go and shoot people in Iraq. So this idea that, what choice did he have? He had orders is ridiculous. You always have a choice. So I don't get that point at all. It doesn't matter that he didn't make the policy. He and his comrades carried out the policy. Imagine if no one carried out the policy. Bush and Cheney would be standing there like the clowns they are, uttering idle declarations. Big deal. Let them say we're going to war with Iraq. And if nobody shows up to fight and nobody goes into the military and everybody refuses to go, who cares what they say? It doesn't make any difference. So this idea that they only carried out the policy doesn't get them off the hook. It takes more than two people to make a policy, one to declare it and others to carry it out.
No, I agree with you, and I think Leonard Reed's piece, when I first read Leonard Reed's piece, Conscience on the Battlefield, I was struck. And Leonard caught a bunch of flack when he wrote the essay. People wrote in, I read Reed's journals, and people wrote in at the time saying, oh, you're blaming the troops, you're blaming the troops. And Reed's response was, I'm placing responsibility on the troops from a moral perspective. And Conscience on the Battlefield is like a conversation between a soldier and his conscience. And the soldier is saying, well, he's dying on the battlefield. And the soldier is saying, I'm not responsible for this. I just following orders. And the conscience says, you can't escape responsibility with that. And let's keep in mind also that the soldier takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution. We all know there was no declaration of war from Congress for the Iraq War. And that's what the Constitution requires. So the soldiers had an out. They could have said, Mr. President, I cannot go into this invasion because it violates the Constitution that I've taken an oath to support and defend. But as I've written so many times in the past, the soldiers are really the private army of the president. They're going to do whatever the president orders. The president orders you go and invade Bolivia and you kill people in Bolivia and you install a new regime. The soldiers are going to obey, just like soldiers in Egypt are obeying orders to fire on their own people. Soldiers obey orders. That's just a flat fact of life. And this is why our founding fathers, our framers, one of the reasons they were so opposed to standing armies, not only because they were a grave threat to the freedom and well-being of the citizenry, because sometimes the guns are turned against their own people, like they are in Egypt, which, of course, is being supported by the U.S. government and the U.S. national security state. But also it's this acknowledgement that soldiers follow orders, and they're going to do whatever the president says. And you can see this in the sense that the soldier's not going to question anything that the president says. He in the soldier's mind, he is supporting and defending the Constitution whenever he obeys the president's orders. Now, I want to raise something. You had the second to the last line in your piece, which about the Adam Lanza comparison, the guy that goes in and kills a bunch of people in the school. I thought it was a little bit inflammatory, but your comparison is very interesting. I'd like you to address it. The way I see it is you've got a distinction here. You've got this crazy guy that goes into a school and kills a bunch of innocent people, innocent children, and then you've got this soldier over here who's defending his fellow soldiers in a war of aggression by killing people that he really shouldn't be killing. And the reason I think there's a distinction there, but I think it's a distinction without a difference because he's still killing people wrongfully. Both sets of people are killing people wrongfully. And the way I look at this is suppose you had a big high-rise building. And you had a team of burglars that were going to break into the building and steal valuables throughout this high rise. And they put a sniper on an adjoining building to protect them in case the security guards discover them. Well, lo and behold, the security guards find them out, and there's a shootout where the security guards are fighting against the burglars, and all of a sudden the sniper, who's part of the burglar team, starts shooting the security guards. Now, let's say the burglars get back to burglar headquarters. I mean, undoubtedly, they would see that sniper as heroic. Man, thank you, Chris, for helping us out here, man. You saved us. But from an objective standard, the way I look at it, he's not a hero at all. He's killing security guards that have a right to be protecting this building from theft. And that's exactly what was going on in Iraq here. The Iraqi people, under principles of international law and basic principles of self-defense and basic principles of morality, had a right to defend their country from an unlawful, illegal war of aggression. And therefore, any troop, sniper, bomber, Air Force pilot, Navy, whatever, they didn't have the right to kill even one single Iraqi in either in the defense of themselves or in the defense of other soldiers. How do you see that comparison?
Well, to get back to the inflammatory sentence where I compared Kyle with Adam Lanza, who killed lots of children and some teachers at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Of course, I didn't say they were identical. People don't read carefully, especially when they're reading in a white heat. I said they were essentially the same. There was no essential difference, and I picked the word carefully. Sure, you can find lots of differences. We could spend the rest of the day listing the differences. But if you strip it to bare essentials, then I see a huge similarity. Both, and kind of going over material you just recited. Both of them invaded a place that they had with hostile intentions, that they had, with lethal intentions, that they had no right, heavily armed, that they had no right to enter. That's number one. Okay. They then proceeded to kill people who represented no threat to them, who had never threatened them previously, period. And the third thing is the victims were defenseless. Now, the first two probably don't need a lot of explanation. I mean, people may not agree with me, but they certainly see what I'm getting at. We both have said today that Kyle was part of an invasion force, an occupation force. The first person he killed, according to his book, was a woman who was carrying a grenade, he thought at least, and maybe she was, I'm not saying she wasn't, out to greet a convoy of Marines that were converging on her village. So the Marines weren't there, bringing chocolates. This was an invasion force after a decade of devastating Iraqi society. So this was an invasion and his purpose was to kill people. He didn't know whom he was killing. He claims he was killing scum and what did he call them? Savages, despicable evil. He didn't know. Do you think he knew? You think he knew some of them were which ones were henchmen of Saddam Hussein previously, and which ones perhaps were simply villagers who didn't like a foreign army, coming from a non-Muslim nation coming to conquer them and rule the place. He didn't have resumes on his people. He stood there, like you said, like the burglar, the people protecting the burglars. Now, what about this defenseless point? This may be the most controversial point of my 3 points. I said that in both cases, the victims were defenseless. Well, the children were obviously defenseless, and the teachers were defenseless. It was a no-gun zone, after all. But Kyle's targets were defenseless, too. He's standing at a huge distance, many yards from his victims, from his targets. They had no idea he was drawing a bead on them. They couldn't pull a gun and shoot in self-defense. And if they knew they were being targeted, it seems to me they would have taken cover. The fact that they're standing out there doing whatever they were doing when he shoots them shows that they were defenseless. And so I think there's a similarity there. I don't believe that comparison is illegitimate. I've written that up at length on my own blog, sheldonrichman.com. People are free to go read it and critique it. But I made a case. I didn't just flip off that line to make people mad or to get attention, which some people think, for some reason I want to get attention. No, I don't need that kind of attention, thanks. I did it because it was the summation of the argument and the facts I had set forth in the article. If I had just said that and nothing else, like on a blog, just said he's like Adam Lanza, yeah, you might say, what's this guy thinking? I mean, there's not even anything to support this. But read the article. It was the conclusion of a reasoned case. I'll disagree with it, but don't say I didn't argue dispassionately for the point of view. And if you're going to make an argument back at me, make an argument. Don't just call me names. I mean, that just shows you don't have an argument. I asked a friend of mine who's a conservative, why have they responded the way they responded, which includes lots of sexual allusions, which I don't understand. And he's not a crazy right-wing warmonger, but he's a conservative. He said to me, because that's all they got. I said, why did they answer like that? He said, that's all they got. I thought that was a pretty honest and telling response.
I totally agree with that. I think it reflects intellectual insecurity, that people are insecure with respect to their positions. And so they start lashing out with personal attacks and diatribes and rantings without any reasoned argument because, well, I think, Sheldon, at the core of this is that there's deep frustration and anger among the statists. I mean, look what's happened with their grand and noble experiment where they had U.S. troops going in there and killing people in this invasion. I mean, it's a total fiasco. They were there for 11 years. They had the opportunity to create their paradise of freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, that they could kill people to their heart's content in order to create their model society. And they did kill people to their heart's content, every single person that resisted their invasion and their occupation. And look what's left. All the troops that died there died for nothing. Nobody can deny that. Just like in Vietnam, they died for nothing. Look at the mess. You got ISIS now. You got a massive civil war going on over there. I mean, even the statists will have to acknowledge that this thing has turned out to be a total fiasco by the virtue of the fact that they're now calling for more intervention against ISIS, which is really largely composed of the people that they ousted from power in their invasion. So you've got this anger and this frustration that interventionism has failed once again, as it's always failed. It's no different in Afghanistan. It's just a brutal, corrupt, dictatorial regime there. And so here we are as libertarians. I mean, we're still fighting this fight. And you're right that there is a certain particular number of statists they'll never reform. They're committed to statism. They're committed to interventionism, to empire, to wars of aggression, to torture, assassination. Fine. But we libertarians have to continue maintaining the high ground, speaking the truth, speaking in terms of principles, restoring a peaceful, prosperous, harmonious society, restoring the principles that our founding fathers and the framers intended for this country. That we've abandoned those principles. That is, the statists have caused our nation to abandon those principles. And in order to get the nation, the country, back on the right track, we've got to dismantle this national security state, the statist apparatus that the statists have brought to our nation. Anyway, that's the show. This is the Libertarian Angle. That's Sheldon Richman. I'm Jacob Hornberger. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.